So welcome to Preparing for Particles. In this video we're just going to be getting ourselves all set up ready to use particle systems. So I'll see you in there. So let's start focusing on projectiles. We're going to be laying the groundwork here, as I said. So one thing, we don't need an auto mortar in the scene. The other thing is I'd like to get a fire nice and rapidly so I can see my projectiles and I can see the smoke they're going to be leaving behind. I don't want to wait 3 seconds. So let's go to the tank blueprint, aiming component, turn the reload time down to maybe 0.1 of a second and compile that. So now I can fire rapidly, but I also want to be able to fire more than 3 rounds. And it slightly disappoints me that I can't set the number of rounds here in Blueprint. So let's go fix that quickly. In the tank aiming component header file, we have int rounds left equals 3. Well, firstly, it shouldn't be int. It should be int32 or uint32. So int32 and uint32 are both platform independent implementations of the int, which Unreal is using, and it makes sure that when we deploy to different platforms we actually get what we're expecting to get rather than getting a 64-bit or a 16-bit integer. So we're going to use int32. Why not uint32, which is the unsigned integer? Because it's not compatible with what I'm about to do, which is the u property, and we want it visible anywhere, which is a bit strange, I know, but it will actually let us. Sorry, we don't want it visible anywhere. We want exactly the same annotation as this, as the reload time and the other bit. So we want edit defaults only. In fact, I'm going to move this guy right up here like this alongside the other properties. And I'm even going to put the projectile blueprint up a bit. And that way, all of our firing metrics that we're able to set in the blueprint are sitting next to each other. But I'm going to use int32 for that. So let me go and do a search in my project. Control H will do a search and replace for int. And that wants to become int32, matching whole words. And you'll find that I've used it here in get rounds left const in the public part of the getter, in the definition of the declaration of the getter. So we replace that one. And where else have I done it? Well, I don't want to just search the current document. I want to search the entire project. And of course, it's in the definition of the function there. And that is it. No more ints in our entire project. You see the approach there? Rather than just fixing the one problem we had, I thought let's fix all instances of using int. Luckily, we only used it in one place, so there's a bit of a mistake. In the first section, of course, I drilled into you to use int32 and then forgot myself. I'm only human. So now this is going to be editable in Blueprint. Let's go ahead and compile. And what I'm expecting to see is, well, that it'll rip focus away from me callously, probably. But if it does compile, when I go back into the tank aiming component, I should see in the firing section on the right over here the ability to set the number of rounds up to a lot more. Maybe I'll set 20 or something so that we can fire off rounds till our heart's content. There you go. And then the compilation of the blueprint's real quick, and then now I can fire boom, 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 and that's absolutely fine. Cool. So now let's think about how we're going to compose the projectile blueprint. Firstly, I'm going to move it into a projectile folder because it's no longer directly about the tank. Now, it's complaining. Graph is linked to some hot reloaded tank aiming component. What's the problem? Sometimes this is because you've got more than one copy of Unreal open. I don't appear to have, so I'm going to close Unreal, saving everything that I can, and just reopen it. Because I do want to move that projectile out and into its own folder so that we can start building up all the particle effects and everything in its own folder. So I think it moved. I think it is there in the projectile folder. Let's just have a quick look through the folders while we're here. Battleground has stuff only relating to the battleground. Blueprints, I think I'll move the mortar into the mortar folder. Otherwise, these blueprints contain pure blueprints. That's fine. The mortar has all mortar stuff and mortar materials. The projectile has that. The tank still has the tank player controller. I think I'll move that back to blueprints because it looks like these others. They're all just kind of pure blueprints. Tank just has tank and tank assets, and UI is all good. Okay, so on this projectile blueprint, if we take a look at it, we can see at the moment that we have a default scene root and then a sphere that we added to it. I'm actually going to get rid of the sphere in the projectile blueprint altogether, and we're going to build up this projectile blueprint purely from C++. In fact, I want you to do that. So what we're going to do is, we've done this before. In fact, if you go into your projectile.cpp, you'll find that we already did this. We created default subobjects. So what I want you to do is the same thing. Set up the projectile components from C++. Create default subjects, subobjects even, for a uStatic mesh component and call it collision mesh, and a uParticle system component and call it launch blast. Make them uProperty visible anywhere, also put a category. And check they appear on the blueprint and all that their properties appear on the blueprint as well. So go ahead, pause the video and do that now. Okay, welcome back. So let's make this happen. Let's start off I'm going to start off on the header file, I think. These are going to be private. So we're going to want a couple of things. What did I say they were? A uStatic mesh component. Pointer called collision mesh. Now we're going to use that to detect when the projectile hits things. Okay, if I can type straight, null pointer. Okay, and then the other thing we're going to want is a uParticle system component, which we'll explore in some detail in the upcoming videos, and we're going to call it launch blast and make it the null pointer. Great, okay, so now that we have these things, let's go and attach them as default subobjects, starting off with the collision mesh. I'll start at the top with that. So we're going to say the collision mesh equals create default, in fact I'm just going to copy create default subobject, and it's going to be a uStatic mesh component. And did you remember that you need to give it an F name? And why call it anything more complicated than collision mesh? Okay, great. So that is adding a collision mesh programmatically. Should we just test that real quick? No harm, is there? Let's we'll test the first one. And what I'm hoping will happen is a collision mesh will pop in here. Then we want to do a couple of things with that to make sure that we know that it's the root component, etc. But let's just check that it comes in a tool. And then I'll whip through the rest of the C++ with you. Some of these bits I can't expect you to have done. So here you go. We have collision mesh here. We have a default scene root, which we can actually delete now. If we can't delete it, I think it'll go away if we just close and reopen the editor. Unreal's a bit funny about that default scene root, likes to hold on to it until you next close it. Otherwise, it'll go away when we add the next object. So let's just look at the projectile blueprint, full editor. There you go. So we just have a collision mesh. That's what we've said in C++. All right, so let's carry on with this now then. We're going to set root component. Now, you weren't expected to do this in the challenge, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to explicitly say I want the collision mesh to be the root component over in Blueprint. I'm also, while I'm here, just going to do a couple of other things. I'm going to say to the collision mesh, set notify rigid body collision to true. Now, what does that do? Well, before we compile that line, if you look at the collision mesh, well, firstly, we can't see any details of the collision mesh. So let me go back to the header file and do what I suggested you did, which is make this both of these things a uProperty, visible anywhere, with a category, I would say components. Always add a category unless you have a reason not to. And visible anywhere is a bit strange actually in this instance because it is actually going to let us edit the values on the collision mesh. And then what I set here in the C++ with my set notify rigid body collision true means that if I make another blueprint class based on the projectile class, that this checkbox will be ticked by default. Let me show you the checkbox. Click collision mesh. Now you can see all its properties. Down here, simulation generates hit events. That is this, set notify rigid body collision. And you can see now that it is defaulting to true. If I turn it off, we get a little revert arrow because the default is true. I'm setting sensible defaults. That's what I'm doing here. Okay, so while I'm there, we may as well also say that the default for this collision mesh is for the visibility. And how would I find that? Well, you'd search for the word visibility. You'd find it there. And I generally want it to be false in the future. But for now, I'm going to leave it as true. Yeah, I want it to be visible true because I want to see them for now. But in general, when you're creating these things, we're not going to have big ugly balls. We're just going to be able to see projectiles because they leave smoke. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. All right, so the other thing we need to create is the launch blast, right? So we say launch blast equals, and then it's another create default subobject. And then it's a uProjectile... particle system component. Don't worry about the particle emitter components. You'll understand what they are shortly. And we need to give it an F name. And again, why complicate things? Just call it launch blast. Great. Now, is there anything we want to do with that launch blast? Well, the only thing I want to do with it is to make sure that it attaches itself to the collision mesh. Because the collision mesh, the thing that's going to detect what it's hitting, the big cannonball, wants to take with it the particle system that we're going to spend the next few lectures developing, and it wants to be depositing lumps of smoke behind it. So I'm just going to say launch blast, and since I say a couple of these things are not expected of you from the challenge, we're going to say attach to root component. And that will go ahead and attach it in the right place. So I didn't expect you to set either of these two, the notify rigid body or the visibility, and I didn't really expect you to do the attach to either. Of course, it's not equals attached to, we're doing an arrow operator. Launch blast attached to root component. Okay, let's go ahead and compile. Then we'll look at the blueprint, I'll recap the code, and we are done for laying the foundations of setting up the particle systems. So here it is, collision mesh with a launch blast on it. The collision mesh is visible, well, it's invisible by default, but we're leaving it visible for a moment. Simulation generates hits, events has been set as default. That's great. So if I play the game and fire now, I actually get invisible. I want visible, so let's just make sure I can make it visible. Compile. Maybe I need to save. Okay, now the reason it's not visible, of course, is simply that I have not assigned a mesh to that now. Now, be careful, where are you going to get your sphere mesh from? We don't have a sphere anymore, right? So we need to think about going and getting ourselves a sphere from the starter content, reinforcing what we did in the last lecture. So we can add new content or feature pack. We can go and add the starter content, and that's fine. Now watch the source control as we do this. F5. It's going to have suddenly a load of starter content come in. Great, that's fine. We want to go find the sphere in there. Should be in there somewhere. And sphere is just a static mesh. I'm going to move that to the projectile. Now I can delete the starter content again. And that's much neater. We're not holding on to a whole bunch of stuff in this project that we don't need. I'm just grabbing the sphere that I need for the projectile, putting it into the starter, putting it into the folder it should be in, and then getting rid of the rest of the starter content. So it says that here the game projectile is referencing a basic wall material. I don't care, I don't need that material. Let's just delete that, let all this starter content go. Pop back into the projectile. Make sure that the collision mesh actually has a sphere mesh on it now. It doesn't have any materials. Do we have a material? A rust material will do. Might as well reuse the material we have. So I'm setting the static mesh and the material like that. Let's compile. Make sure that we can see, yes we can, our rusty collision, our rusty, projectile there. That's all good. Fantastic news. So I'm just going to close the editor now. I'm going to close Visual Studio. I'm just going to make sure that on the disk we do not have in content, we do not have a starter content folder. Just reopen to make sure everything runs and we are in good shape. So this starter content stuff could start to become a pain. If it does, we'll look at further solutions. But we've done number one, which is we've stabilized our system. We know what's changing and what's not changing. Everything is tracked properly under source control now. That is good. That's worth fighting for. Then what we will do, if we really think this is a hassle dealing with starter content this way, we'll find another solution, possibly using GetLFS, which is the large file storage. So finally, let's see what's changed. We've just got a few changes that have come in here in this instance. We have a few changes to some assets, we have some changes to our code, etc., but no massive like starter pack or anything in here, just a few expected changes. Okay, fantastic. So I'll stage all those and see you in the next video.